Welcome to LabMIS.com in our lab video series on Cisco ACI. This is Metha, your instructor for this video series. For a complete list of our ACI videos, you can visit our website under the Data Center section. There you can also sign up for our newsletters to receive the latest video updates. In our last video, we enabled out-of-band management connections to the Fabric switches. If you compare that to the Cisco traditional switches, that was equivalent to configuring switch management interfaces. The next step that you usually take after doing that is putting some kind of switch global configuration like domain name, DNS servers, and NTP on it. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this video. It's just that in ACI, this is done through a configuration of Fabric Policies. For our lab setup, we already have an ACI Fabric that's been fully provisioned, and the fabrics are made up of two spines, spine 1 and 2, with the ID 201, 202, and 4 leaf switches, leaf 1, 2, 3, and 4 with these IDs. And the fabric is being controlled by a cluster of 3 APIC servers, APIC 1, 2, and 3. And all these components are connected via out-of-band management subnet that we configured in the last video, VLAN 99, 172.16.99.0/24, although not really showing this diagram, but all these switches has their management interface connected to our out-of-band switches right here, switch number 1. Then we have a VLAN 32, which is our server VLAN 172.16.32.0/24, and on that VLAN we have our Windows 2012 that we are using for an RDP jump box at the IP of .40. Since we're going to be configuring DNS server, that's going to be acting as our DNS server as well. Right, it's Windows 2012 domain controller. All right, let's talk about Fabric Policies. So Fabric Policies govern the operation of the overall underlying fabric. And this includes settings like hardware protocols and network services that requires to make the fabric function. For the most part, the ACI is very good in providing you with default settings. So even without something explicitly configured, it will be able to work using the default values. However, there's still certain things that you will need to configure yourself. If you take a look under the Fabric Policy page, which let me bring that up for you, it's going to be under Fabric. And that's our web interface to the APIC number 1.11. Here, there's the menu option for Fabric Policy, and you can see the configurable options on the left-hand side. You can see it could be a little overwhelming. So what we have done is breaking this down into a relationship diagram just to make it easier for you to digest, and the diagram is right there. So before we go ahead and configure anything, let's take a quick look at this. At high level, we are configuring 3 main policies, and they are the switch level policies right there. You got the pod level policies, and then you also have a global policies. Let me make this a little bigger. There you go. So the switch level policies are specific settings on switches, including hardware control and monitoring, with the spine and leaf having their own policies. And the switch level policy is actually made up of 3 different types of policy group. There's switch policy groups, module policy groups, and interface policy groups. So you can see combining that gives you what's called a switch profile that will get applied to spine and leaf. Then we have a pod level policies, which are specific settings to a fabric in a pod as a whole. And these are settings that are required to be consistent across all switches. And you can see these things like daytime, ISIS, COOP, route reflector for the BGP, SNMP. And then we have a global policies, which are settings that affect the entire ACI deployment. That's why it's called global. The concept of configuring switch and pod level policies are the same. You configure individual policies, you group them into policy groups based on their type, and then you apply it to something, and that something could be the spine and the leaf for the pod. All right, now to start the configuration, we will configure the individual policy. So let me maybe move that to the side right here so we can see them at all time, and we are going to be starting at creating a monitoring policy. All right, it's going to be right here, monitoring policy. So monitoring policies control overall monitoring of associated components. It determines how stats are collected, determines the stat threshold settings, and how the faults are generated for the system. There's so much that you can tweak under the monitoring policies, and normally the default values is acceptable. Yep, you can click into one of these default one, even expand it, and you can see that there's a lot more options that you can get into depending on what aspect of monitoring you want to configure or adjust. All right, let's go ahead and create a new policy, but just use the default setting. We want to give it our own name, that way we don't have to rely on the default. Let's call it mon POL for policy. Maybe we'll throw the uppercase LM in it so we know it's ours, and default. Submit. You can see you can expand that, and you can adjust all these thresholds as much as you want. All right, this one concerns the granularity of the collected stats based on the retention period, for example. Yep, and you can expand all these. You see, like this guy, you can make changes to it, right? Just to give you an example. Since we're referring to the list on the diagram here, the next one would be tech support export policy. Although the policy is not really contained on this page, you actually have to jump to the admin and look for export policy. So right here, import export and export policy, and one of the options should be tech support right there. All right, this is the package containing configuration, log, and diagnostic data used by TAC for troubleshooting when you call them up to get assistance. You can schedule the package to be created and kept on or off the APIC server. Usually we only need to create this on demand when working with TAC, so we can actually skip this one, right? But by default, there's one policy for tech support called default. You can see this is created for an on-demand since there's no scheduler tied to it. It will export all categories. And all you need to do to get this going is to either select export to controller, which means the file will be kept local on Apex, or specify export destination in case of remote location storage, and then select your scheduler. All right, next we have core export policy, which is in the same configuration area down below. There's an option for core. This is similar to a tech support export, but this deals with the device core file generated at the hardware failure, device failure. There's a default policy that saves the file on controller right there called default, collection type core only, and it will be exported to controller, so we can just use that. I guess this is similar to when you have a core dump file on Cisco switches that will get saved to flash. Yep, that's what it is. All right, next we have what's called inventory policy. Now let's go back to the fabric. And this is under switch policy, I believe. All right, policies and call home inventory policies. This is used to schedule for sending fabric inventory information to an email destination of your choice. So we can go ahead and create one if you want to do that. I just want to show you how you can configure it. Let's call it call home LM and disable. And that's because we are going to keep that disable by switching the start now to disable. We'll keep everything by default. If you have that enabled, then you have to pick destination group, right, which is where you want this sent to, and an associated scheduler, which will determine when this will get sent. All right, we're going to keep that disabled. Now keep going from the hardware perspective. We have a power redundancy policy, which is right below that call home inventory here. This dictates how the switch chassis handle power redundancy. Very similar when you configure the power redundancy on a regular Cisco switches, where you can do a combined redundant N+1 and all that. So let's go ahead and create one for our switches. Name power LM, and we're gonna choose to do combined, which is the default right here. The other two options available is N+1 redundancy and N+N redundancy. All right, click submit. Pretty straightforward. Next, we have analytic policy. I believe it's down below, analytic policy. And this is only applicable if you have titration cluster to send data to. And you can see that if you do have that, you have to provide cluster information, the name, IP address, port, and the SCP value. this doesn't really concern us right now, so we can skip that. Right, analytics equal titration. And I believe the last one that we need to configure for switch policy group is the node control policy, which I believe is the last option right here. Fabric node control policies enable digital optical monitoring, or DOM, or set preferences between titration and net flow. Right, so there's two things that you can do right here. Enable the DOM, and then you feature a selection, whether you want to use net flow or set that as a high priority, or using titration as a high priority. You can use one or the other, but not both. All right, so create one called node CTRL control analytic, and we are going to enable digital optical monitoring, and we're going to leave the analytics being the priority. Click submit. And you can see we didn't really quite make a whole lot of adjustment, and you might be fine with the default settings. And I just want to show you the different options that are available under the switch policy groups. Now that we have all of the policies created, we can create the policy group. Okay, so under the policy, there's a section for policy group. You can right click on it, and they are separated into the spine and leave. So if you have to create two different policy groups, we'll start with the spine. So click on spine, we'll name it switch policy spine, right? LM spine. And now just a matter of selecting the policy that we created earlier for monitoring. Tick support, we didn't create anything. You can leave it out. I believe you don't have any values selected, just revert to the default. Or you can just select the default as well. Inventory, call home, power redundancy, we had that created. And node control, we also had that created. All right, click submit. And we can repeat that process for the leave. Leave. And we can go through the same selection. All right, then submit. And now we have both policy groups configured for the leave and the spine. All right, and I guess I didn't point out earlier, only the leave is applicable to the analytics policy because we didn't get that option under the spine. So now we got one policy groups out of the way, which is a switch policy group. Next we have the module policy group. Right here, module policy groups, and what we need to configure is only the monitoring policy, and we can just use the same one that we created earlier. So all we need to do is to create a spine the leave module policy group. Right, start with module POL LM spine, following the same naming convention that we have going on. Select default monitoring policy, submit, and then the leave. Call it the leave. And default monitoring policy, submit. Pretty easy there. Then we have the last policy group to take care of for our switch profile, which is the interface policy group. Same thing, the only thing you need to configure there is the monitoring policy. So interface policy, go ahead, create a policy group. And by the way, the module policy group, monitoring policy that gets applied to the switch hardware module as opposed to the interface policy groups right here, the monitoring policy applies to the switch fabric ports. So we call this one interface policy LM spine. And then create the one for the leave. All right, submit. Let's go back and refer to the diagram real quick. So for the module policy, we need to apply that to the module, and this is being done via a module profile. So we have the policy, now we have to create a profile. And again, we have a separate profile for spine and the leave. We'll call it module, PRO for profile, LM spine, And we need to associate our policy groups that we created to module. You can see there's different type of modules that you can apply this to: the line card module, fabric module, supervisor module, or a system control module. We're gonna go ahead and apply to them all. So line card and then fabric, supervisor, and system controller. Submit. Then we repeat that for our leaf switches. It's called module Pro LM leaf. For the leaf, there's only line card and supervisor module, since the leaf switches does not support the modular chassis type of switches yet, which would be the only type that has the fabric module or the, I guess the other one was it, the power supply module, was it? Let's go back and yep, apply that. And supervisor. Update. All right, only line card and supervisor as opposed to, let me go back and take a look real quick. Yep, the other one has, system control and a power supply. All right, and then the fabric module. So that's pretty much done for the module. Next, we go back to the interface policy, do the exact same thing, because the interface policy group needs to be applied to interfaces via interface profile. So we need to create a profile for our interfaces. Create a spine fabric interface profile. We'll call it, or name it interface PRO-LM spine. Then we associate that to the interfaces. And like I said, this is only for the fabric interface, which is usually the uplink. And let's go back and take a look at the diagram real quick. Yep, it seems like the way that we have it connected right now, the leaf switches are connected to only port 1 through 4 on the spine. All right, so this will be name leaf block, be 1/1 through 4. And you can see the format there as well. We have that hovering. Do you have the format correctly? I believe that should be fine. And then the policy group is the spine interface policy group right there. All right, click submit. And then for the leaf, since we have two different models of leaves here, their uplink interface are different. I believe these two guys are the 93180YC, and they have, or the first uplink ports is 49. We use two of those, so 49 and 50, as opposed to the leaf 3 and 4, which is the LC version. Its uplink port is 29 and 30. So we essentially need to create two separate leaf profile here. Let's create one for interface profile leaf, and this would be 93180 YC. With the name spine, with the uplink 149 to 50, and apply the policy. Submit, create one more, call interface profile LM leaf 93180, this times LC for leaf 3 and 4. And the uplink is 129 to 30. Apply the policy. All right. Now we're going to be putting everything that we created so far together into a switch profile. And so now we are actually going to be applying our policies to physical switches via the profile. So create the spine profile, switch profile, spine. Let's make it LM spine. The associated switch will be two spines with the ID of 201. Actually, we can just select it right there, 201, 202. And we got the switch policy group for that, right, which is this guy right there. Update select module association, and select interface association. You can see that once you have these components pre-configured, it's actually pretty straightforward to create the profile because you have everything that you need ready to be selected right here. Submit. All right, as soon as you submit that, all these policy gets applied to the specified node or switches. Next, we need to create the leaf switch profile. We switch profile lm leaf 93180 YC. Add switch called leaf, and we know that is only the first two switches, 101, 102, that has that model. Apply policy group, select the module association, and make sure we select the corresponding interface association for the YC. Submit. Create one last one for a switch 3 and 4 for the leaf. So switch profile leaf 93180 LC. Call that leaf. For the block is 3 and 4. And apply the switch policy groups for the leaf. Sorry, it's an LC. Yep, and that should be that guy selected. And submit. There you go. Every time you've done a bunch of configuration before moving on, you probably want to go back and make sure there's no faults that's been raised by the system. So we can go back and it looks like we're still clean there. All 0. That means there's no issue with our configuration. So we can move on to the next type of policy, which is the pod level policies. For pod level policies, these are the list of policy groups that we need to create. So let's go through that in that same order. Go under the pod policy sections, expand the policies, and the first one is date and time. All right, so this is equivalent to setting up a time zone as well as NTP server. It is very important, and I can't stress this enough, to have consistent time across your fabric because a lot of components relies on accurate and synchronized time, certificate being one of them. Okay, so create a date time policy, call time policy lm default. Status would be enable. We're not going to be bothering with NTP authentication, so we're going to keep authentication status disable. Then we are going to add our NTP server. We're going to use the out-of-band switch, switch 1, which has a loopback IP of 172.16.0.10. That will be our preferred NTP server. And we need to specify which management EPG you want the system to use in order to contact the NTP server. This is why we had to get the out-of-band management out of the way in the previous video, otherwise we would not be able to complete this section right here. But now that we do have out-of-band EPG, we use the default. If you watched our last video, we take advantage of the default out-of-band management EPG. So that's what we are going to select. Click OK and finished. Yep, and that's a policy we just created. Now selecting at the default, this is where you set the time zone. And by default, the display format is local. You can switch to UTC if you like. And then you select your time zone right here. And for us, it's going to be America. Let me see if I can find what I need for Pacific Standard Time. I guess I can find Los Angeles. Oh, I just passed that. There you go. And offset state, we can keep that enabled. Click Submit. And I do not recall seeing this policy warning so far. I mean, I've seen it, but I don't think we have encountered it in this video series. And so I just want to make a quick note here. Anytime you make changes to the configuration that will take effect immediately on the fabric components that's currently using that policy or part of the configuration, it will throw up a warning and say, hey, these guys are currently using this. If you make changes to it, they will be affected. So obviously we're making changes to the time zone, which will affect all of the switches in the fabric. So these are the nodes that's using this policy. Our leaf and spine switches. But there's actually policies that's using this policy as well. Yep, just acknowledge that and submit the changes. There's a way to disable that too, but I would say just leave it alone so that way you always get reminded when you're about to make changes that will affect a bunch of stuff, and that way you can take a quick pause and make sure that your hand didn't slip or anything and it wasn't a mistake. Next we have the ISIS policy, which is this guy right here. You can't really create a new one. You can only make changes to the default policy, and these are just a bunch of timers that control ISIS protocol. I would say just leave it at default. This is a very spatialized timers, and you probably don't want to mess around with it. So we're not going to touch that. Next is the group policy, and this policy, I want to say, it used to be located in the same section right here in the previous version, being the 2.x, but since the version 3 came out, it's been moved to the under system settings, which we can go to under system and system settings. So I wasn't sure why that would have been moved to right there, because I would think that if it's going to be used by the pod level policy or the pod profile, then it would make sense to keep it on the other page. But anyway, just FYI, this is where you would find it now. And there isn't really anything to create here, but to adjust from the default value if need to. So it allows you to switch between compatible type and the strict type. Compatible meaning that the MD5 authenticated and unauthenticated sessions for Coop will be allowed, as opposed to strict type, which means it will always enforce the MD5 authentication. We're going to leave that at the default, which is compatible type. Then we have the BGP route reflector, right, which has also been moved to this page, BGP route reflector. And I mentioned in the ACI fundamental video that ACI uses MPBGP to distribute external layer 3 routes to the fabric, right? Once it learns from the external L3 out, whether it's via static routes or routing protocols. And this is where you configure which spine is going to be a route reflector. For us, since we only have 2 spines there, and of course we want always to have redundant route reflector, we're going to use both of them. Since this is part of the BGP routing protocol, you're always going to need to assign a autonomous system number. And we're going to use 65,000, right? Just to keep it a private number. And then you specify which node is going to become a route reflector. For the spine, that's going to be 201. Click Submit, which is spine number 1, and then 202. And click Submit. Just like that, our spine 1 and 2. I guess not until we click Submit, it will become a route reflector for MPBGP. Then we have management access policy, and I believe we go back to the pod policy right here, since I think there's 2 more subsection that we have to configure. Management access. This is where you control remote access services on the nodes, whether they are HTTP, HTTPS, Telnet, SSH, or SSH access via web. Let's create one ourselves. Call management access LM default. So I guess this section right here is very similar to IP HTTP server or secure server on the CAT switches. And by default, HTTP port 80 is disabled. And we want to keep it that way. We'll keep HTTPS enabled, obviously, because that's how we access our web GUI. To keyring, we'll select the default. And we'll talk about keyring and certificate, I believe, in the next video. That's just equivalent to saying that ACI is going to be using the default self-signed cert. SSH we need to enable if we want to remote SSH access. Telnet, never enable that unless it's a lab environment type. But even so, you can use SSH, so there's no reason almost to enable Telnet. And we can keep SSH access via web disabled. And click Submit on that. And the last pod policy that we need to create is the SNMP policy. This will allow SNMP polling to the Fabric switches. So call it SNMP policy LM default. State is enable, contact, lab minutes IT, location, say headquarter. For the community policy, if you want to use SNMP v2, I believe that's you just provide the community right there, or the string, and then for us, let's go ahead and use SNMP v3. So you need to specify user. We'll use the username SNMP. We'll enable privacy with AES 128. With the key Cisco 123 with the uppercase C in the front. Authentication, use SHA-1, same password or same key. Click OK. All right, and then for the client group policies, this determines the SNMP client that will allow access or allow the polling. Go ahead and add that, and we can just call this one like NMS, Network Management System. Assuming we'll be polling into the out-of-band management interfaces on the Fabric switches. So we select our out-of-band EPG, and then you have to specify the subnet. So here we can call NMS again, and only allow 172.16.00/16 to perform the SNMP poll. Click OK. So that's everything we need to configure for the pod policy. Actually, let me submit that first. Now we have to group them together using the pod policy groups. Create pod policy groups. Name, pod, POL, LM, default. Now it's just a matter of picking or selecting the different policies we created. Start with date and time. ISIS we set a default. COOP default. BGP route reflector default. Management access, the one we created, and SNMP policy is the one we created. Submit. And finally, we need to apply that policy group to the entire pod via a pod profile. The last component we need to create is pod profile. Although you can create a new one, I think I might as well take advantage of the default. Yep, there's a default pod profile right there. This would apply to all the pod, I believe. So we can just go ahead and use that. As you can see, the name is default, type all, block all, but I can show you that. You can create a new one and you can pick all the pods or ranges of pod. If you have multiple pods, there you go. That's the pod ID. We only have one pod, so it doesn't really matter. But if you want to consistently apply the policies to all the pods that you have, might as well just use the default one. Right? All you need to do is to tie that policies to all the pods. Or policy group rather. There you go. Update, and same thing here. Get a little policy usage warning that these are all the components will be affected. This time, 3 of our APEX will be affected from this change. Continue, and all of these configuration we just did just got pushed out and should already taken effect. And towards the end of the video, we'll go back and validate all that. And that's for pod level policies. Then next we've got global policies. And this one is actually pretty straightforward. There's no policy groups or profile. It's just a bunch of settings that you can make changes to, and that's under global policies. And you just go and top down, starting with DNS profiles, and we can just take advantage of the default one. Usually you want consistent DNS settings anyway. This is for configuring DNS server. You can see SDNS provider and DNS domain. So this will allow, with this APEX of switches, to be able to resolve any DNS name. Specify the management EPG that you want the system to use to access DNS on the outside. And we're going to use the out-of-band EPG, just like how we did earlier with NTP and SNMP. For DNS provider, that would be our Windows 2012, the IP of 1632.40. And we can mark that as prefer. For the domain name, that would be labminutes.com. Mark it as default. Update, and this one we didn't even have to hit submit. Straightforward. For the health score policy, this is not really configurable, but it's more as a reference on how the system calculates the health score, and health score is the number from 0 to 100 that we saw in the dashboard. He wants to keep it as close to 100 as possible, and if you wonders how the health scores are calculated, you can take a quick read of this page right here. Multicast tree. Also not really configurable, but it's more on the informational side on how the multicast tree, also known as F-tag trees, are structured. When you see the word F-tag or forwarding tag trees, it just means that it's a different path that the packet can take from the multicast perspective to get from one leaf to another, right? So when leaf needs to send multicast traffic to another leaf, it will use one of these F-tag trees. Nothing you need to do there, right? You can't really right-click and configure anything. Either there's a little drop-down tool icon option on the right. Next is the Fabric L2 MTU policy. So the MTU size for the tenant L2 trunk port by default is 9,000, just like the Fabric MTU that we saw, I believe, when we went through the whole web interface. So we might as well leave that at default, and you can't increase it beyond 9,000. So 9,000 is as high as you can go. And then LLDP policy. These are just settings on the LLDP protocols, things like hold time, delay time, transmit frequency, and the packet contents with the TLV options right here. We can just leave that at the default. So that's it for global policies, not a whole lot to configure there. And the last type of policies that I haven't really included as part of the first three types of policies, the geolocation policies, because it's completely optional. And I'm not sure if you remember back in the Fabric provisioning video, there was a columns on the Fabric membership page called rack number. And once we configure it, I'll go back to that page and show you that as well. But if you do, this is where that rack number is configured, right, under the geolocation policy, which is right here. So what it does is it gives the device a physical location information, and you can expand the default settings. You can see it goes from site, building, down to floor, down to room, down to the racks within the room, and the rack information itself. By default, there's a site default, which doesn't really say much, so we can go ahead and delete it. And then we can create our own geo site. So let's do something fictitious here. You can say site is headquarter. Inside headquarter, there's a building A1. Okay, and inside that building A1, there's floor. Let's say that we have our data center in the basement. So put basement. Inside the data center, or inside that floor, there's a room. And we can call it like a server room. Inside the server room, there's probably multiple rows of racks. And hopefully they are numbered. So we said row number 1. And within that row, there should be several racks. And I'm just going to pick some names, say N5, and being a network rack, number 5. Right? And finally, you can specify the nodes contained within that rack. Yep, so you can pick. Too bad it has to be one by one, so let's go through that. Let's assume that we have everything in that same rack. Four, and then 2 more spines. There you go. All right, so 6 devices. Nothing on the APEC that you can select, and you just keep hitting OK, and it'll take you back 1 level up every time you click OK, and by the time you click submit, and done, you'll see that hierarchy right there. Headquarter, building A1, floor basement, room server. Rack row 1 and rack number 5, and these are the switches. And now, once you have that configured, you can go back to the Fabric inventory, go back to the Fabric membership page, click on it. There you go. And you can see the rack name column for our Fabric switches has been populated with the rack name. And you can change it right here as well, right, by double click on it and select it. We just happen to do it from the policy. Let's go back to the Fabric policy and let's see if there's anything that's been left out. We went through the switch policies already. Policy group profiles, same as module policies, same as interface policies, pod policies, global policies. Yep. We're not going to get into the troubleshoot policies right now. Okay, the last one is probably tenant quota. This is where you can limit resources, mostly logical for each tenant. You can pick the tenants, you can pick the category of resources, and if they exceed that amount of resource, what you want to do, you want to limit it by failed transaction, or you want just to be alerted, right? And you apply the quantity. So I guess it's almost like creating a VDC on a nexus or a firewall context, and then you put some limit on around the resources that the virtual components or virtual container can use. In this case, that virtual container is tenants. And that's pretty much everything that you can configure on or under Fabric policies. Next, we're going to spend some time validating the configuration that we just completed. So let's see what we can validate. Maybe we'll start with the spine switch number 1. Since there's a few things that we can look at there. So here's the console to our LM-spine1. We can do show. By the way, just FYI, if you want to see the configuration or the command options, what you need to do is to hit the escape key twice, right? And then you get this option right there. It's kind of a weird combination or shortcut, but that's basically what you need to do, right? So if you do question mark, it won't work for you. So show environment power, just like the command on the Nexus switches, and you can see all the power supplies information. We've got 3 power supplies there, all okay, actual draw, power allocated, and you can see the power supply redundancy mode is combined, so it's not redundant, and that's the mode that we specify as part of the power supply or power setting policy, right, under the switch. There you go, power supply redundant policy combined. So we know that is working. Then we can do a show. What happened there? Show NTP peer status. Check the NTP configuration. Server is 172.16.0.10. Just like how we configured it, strand 4, and asterisk means to synchronize. So we can do show clock, right? Then let's go ahead and check on, let's see, BGP, route reflector maybe, and that can be done through inventory, and then you expand the pod. Look for the spine. Under there is protocol, BGP. You can see the AS number that we configured. And then BBGP is running as part of the VRF overlay 1. Now you can look at neighbors. You can see right there. So clearly there has been the BGP or MPBGP session has been established between the leaves and the spine. So 4 leaves are talking to this particular spine. And these IPs corresponds to the VTEP address, I believe. Yep, that was handed out to the switch when it joined the fabric. Same deal, you can hit the sessions and you can see there are 4 sessions total. You can look at the exact same thing on the leave, protocol, BGP. If this works correctly, it should be 2 sessions to the spine. Just right there. Okay, so we know that the MPBGP route reflector has been configured correctly and see the address family that's being supported, VPN v4, v6, route target filter address. All right, now to test SNMP, we can try to pull a leave switch. And let me bring up command prompts to make sure I can ping it. I should be able to, since we have the static IP configured for the leave. Out-of-band management IP, it's .101, and that's pingable. So now all I need to do is to bring up SNMPB that we can use to pull that switch. I think I might already have the credential created, so let me check on that real quick. Manage agent profile. Yep, LM leaf 1 right here. The IP is 99.101. Port 161 as an MPv3 with the name as an MP and with authentication and privacy. The user should be specified right here as an MP SHA. The key was the Cisco 123 that we used to set on the SNMP policy, same as the privacy protocol AES 128. So now if I go ahead, selecting leave 1 and just do a walk, there you go. So we are able to perform SNMP pull, and this is also because we have SNMP being allowed as part of the out-of-band management contract filter. All right, when we just remind ourselves, we watched our last video, that was part of the management. And then security policy as part of the out-of-band contract. It's referencing the out-of-band filter. And under the filter, we had HTTPS, ICMP, SNMP, and SSH allow. Right? So it should be matching this guy right here. That's why we are able to pull. And from here, we can look for, maybe I should copy this out. If there's a device name right there, topology. I was looking for the location that we set. There you go, it's contact, laminates IT, and the location is HQ, right? Which is what we configured under the SNMP policy. I believe there was a pod level, was it? Yep, there, SNMP, contact, location. The last thing we're going to test is DNS. And I can just probably use Spine for this as well. If not, I'll hop onto the APIC. Let me see. Can you ping like 4222 right now? Yep, because it has internet access. Can I ping like cisco.com? Oh, that doesn't work. What about LM Win 2012 DC1? I guess it doesn't appear to work from the switch. Maybe we'll jump onto the APIC. Let me bring up PuTTY, close that, go to APIC 99.11. Then do that again. Win 2012 DC1. Yep, there you go. It got resolved to 99.40, which is this guy. Yep, I just happen to have another interface connected directly to 99.40. That way I know that I'm always going to have access to the management IPs on these devices. That's what I got resolved to. And you can see that it resolved cisco.com even. All right, anyway, that's pretty much all I want to cover as far as the Fabric policies. We went through quite a bit of config, although most of the policies that we created just rely on the default values, like I said. So I would say that at the very most, what you need to configure, again, let me refer back to this diagram, is probably things like Power redundancy policy if you want to change it from the combined to the n+1 or n+n. Monitoring policies, if you're okay with the default one, then you didn't really need to create that. Let's go through this. Yep, same for that. And definitely want to configure date time. BGP route reflector. Definitely need to create that too. And SNMP policy. Right, and the DNS. Where is it? Yep, right here, DNS profile. And that should also be fairly consistent from one ACI deployment to another, so you can probably script that out too. All right, that wraps up our video on ACI Fabric Policies. You can visit our website to view an extensive list of our lab videos and sign up to get access to additional lab contents. Thank you for watching labminutes.com, and I'll see you guys in the next videos.